The August sun hit the marble steps of the Cook County Courthouse like a physical weight, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer over the sidewalk and turns every parked car into an oven. I stood at the top of those steps in a cream linen dress I had chosen that morning without thinking, without caring, and in my hand I held a single sheet of paper. The paper was thin. It weighed almost nothing. And yet it was heavier than anything I had ever carried in my 31 years on this earth, because it contained, in small typed print and a judge's raised seal, the death certificate of 5 years of my life. Dissolution of marriage. Eleanor Grace Marsh. Derek Allen Callahan. I ran my thumb over my own name, printed there in a font as indifferent as a parking ticket. Marsh. I had let it slip into the background for 5 years, tucked behind Callahan on every hotel reservation, every school reunion invitation, every holiday card. Today the court had quietly restored it to me, the way you might return a stray animal to the address stitched into its collar. I was Eleanor Marsh again, just Eleanor Marsh. And as of 11:40 that morning, the man who had shared my bed, my name, and, I would later learn, nearly everything my family had built over 3 decades, was legally and permanently a stranger. 5 years earlier, I had been the only child of Charles Marsh, founder and chairman of Marsh Dynamics, a manufacturing and logistics conglomerate that employed almost 4,000 people across 6 states. I had grown up in a house with a circular driveway and a housekeeper who called me Miss Eleanor until I begged her to stop. And when I was 26 years old, dizzy on a kind of love that felt like the only real thing that had ever happened to me, I had gone to my father's study, knelt on the Persian rug in front of his desk, and cried until my voice gave out, insisting that Derek Callahan was a good man. An ambitious man. A man who only needed a chance, a foothold, someone to believe in him the way nobody ever had. My father had looked at me that night with an expression I didn't understand until years later. Not anger, but grief. The specific grief of a man who can already see the ending of a story his daughter is only just beginning to read. He had aged, I swear, 5 years in the space of that single conversation. He had lost my mother when I was 19, and I think some part of him had decided long ago that he would never again tell me no about anything that might make me cry the way I had cried at her funeral. So he sighed, and the gray in his hair seemed to spread visibly across his temples, and he closed his eyes, and he nodded. He let Derek walk through the doors of our family's wealth without a prenuptial agreement. Without so much as a background check beyond the cursory one his lawyers insisted on filing away and never mentioning again. He gave his blessing the way a man surrenders a hostage negotiation he has already lost, quietly, and with his heart in his throat. I did not know it then, but that single heartbroken nod was the opening scene of a tragedy in which I would be hollowed out slowly, over 5 years, bled dry by people who had learned to smile at me while planning, in whispered late-night conversations I was never meant to overhear, exactly how much more of me there was left to take. The sharp click of leather-soled shoes against courthouse tile pulled me back into the punishing present. Derek walked out through the double doors behind me, and even now, even after everything, I felt my stomach twist with something between nausea and disbelief at how easily he wore his own audacity. He had on a charcoal brioni suit, a birthday gift I had bought him 2 years ago that cost more than most people in this country make in 4 months of honest work. And his hair was combed back, with the kind of care a man only takes when he expects to be photographed. His face wore an expression of undisguised, gloating satisfaction, the look of a man who has just won something, not a man who has just watched a 5-year marriage get folded up and filed away in a manila envelope. On his arm was Paige Sutton. 26 years old, a tight scarlet dress that clung to every curve she'd clearly worked hard for, and a quilted designer handbag that I recognized instantly because I was the one who had paid for it, on the supplementary card I had given Derek, for emergencies, 3 Christmases ago. The two of them looked less like the wreckage of a broken home, and more like a couple who had just walked out of a casino with the jackpot still ringing in their ears. "Well," Derek said, that half-smile curling at the corner of his mouth, the same smile that used to make my chest go warm and now made my skin crawl. "Guess that's that. We go our separate ways now, Eleanor. No hard feelings, all right? When the feelings die, you just let each other go. It's cleaner that way." I looked up at him. The straight nose, the bright, boyish eyes that had once convinced an entire boardroom of skeptical investors that he was the future of Marsh Dynamics. The gentle, scholarly warmth that had disarmed my father's oldest friends at dinner parties. All of it, every feature I had once found beautiful, now sat on his face like a mask that had simply slipped, revealing the chilly, practiced shamelessness underneath. My throat tasted like ash, but I did not cry. I had cried enough. I had cried through 3 years of sleepless nights waiting up for a husband who came home smelling like someone else's perfume. Through the night I found the messages on his second phone, the one he thought I didn't know existed, messages sweet enough to rot teeth, sent to at least 4 different women whose names I had, at the time, forced myself not to memorize. Paige leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice ringing bright and shrill across the sun-baked plaza, loud enough that 2 attorneys walking past slowed their pace to listen. "Eleanor, honey, Derek's right. You've got the money, you've got the last name, but you never learned how to keep a man happy. Men need someone soft. Someone who doesn't walk around a room like she's already the smartest person in it. Go home. Hug your bank account. Enjoy your empty house." I closed my clutch around the decree with a small, decisive click, the kind of sound that ends a conversation before it has even finished starting. I looked Paige directly in the eyes, and I let my voice come out perfectly level, perfectly calm, the way you'd correct a child who had said something rude without understanding why it was rude. "You picked up the trash I was already in the process of throwing out," I said, "and you think you found treasure. Enjoy him. Use gloves." Derek's jaw tightened. He took 1 step toward me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, the same bottle I had bought him for his 30th birthday, and his voice dropped into a low, private growl meant only for me. "Don't get cocky, Eleanor. You really think Marsh Dynamics is still the company your daddy built? You spent the last 3 years playing house, baking banana bread and hosting charity galas while I ran operations. Do you have any idea who actually holds the levers in that building now? Your father's 71 years old and slower every quarter. Between my seat as COO and everyone my mother's placed in purchasing, in accounts, in project management. You think you can just walk in there with a piece of paper and pull us out? The roots go deep, Eleanor. You yank on them. You're going to bring the whole tree down with us." He laughed, an ugly, satisfied sound that bounced off the yellowed limestone of the courthouse facade. He believed it completely, that my years of looking the other way, of welcoming his cousins and uncles and in-laws into 6-figure positions across purchasing and accounting and project management, had been the actions of a woman too stupid and too in love to notice what was happening around her. His mother, Diane Callahan, a woman who had spent the first half of her life running a folding table at a Saturday flea market outside Rockford, had spent the second half of it perfecting a performance of humble sweetness in front of me. All the while, I knew, because I had known for a long time, quietly funneling company money through a network of shell corporations she thought I was too naive to notice. They believed I was blind. They believed I was deaf. What they failed to understand was that even a tiger lying perfectly still, eyes half closed in what looks like sleep, is still the apex predator of the jungle. I turned my back on both of them and walked to my car without looking back. The sun so bright in my eyes it was almost blinding, and yet somehow, for the first time in years, everything felt clear. It was time to clean the garbage out of my own house. It was time for this daughter, who had spent 5 years defending the wrong people out of pride and stubbornness, to go home and finally apologize to her father. I slid into the driver's seat of my Range Rover and rolled up every window, sealing myself off from the noise of the city until the silence inside the cabin was so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I did not start the engine right away. I sat there with the decree in my lap and my phone in my hand, and I let myself, for just a few minutes, remember how any of this had ever seemed like a good idea. I had met Derek Callahan at a fundraising gala for a children's hospital wing my mother had helped establish before she died. I was 24, freshly out of my MBA program, working in Marsh Dynamics' strategy division under an assumed junior title because my father wanted me to earn my way up rather than be handed a corner office. Derek had been hired 18 months earlier as a mid-level operations analyst, sharp enough with numbers and, more importantly, sharp enough with people. He found me by the dessert table, told me my mother's charity work had changed the trajectory of his cousin's childhood asthma treatment, a story I would later learn was almost entirely fabricated, and asked me, with a shy, self-deprecating laugh, whether it was inappropriate for an analyst 3 pay grades below me to ask the chairman's daughter to dance. It was inappropriate. I danced with him anyway. For the first year he was patient in a way that felt, at the time, like devotion, and that I would later understand was simply strategy given enough time to mature. He never pushed. He never asked for anything. He let me believe I was the one falling first, the one chasing, the one who had to convince my father that this ambitious, hard-working young man from a modest Rockford family deserved a chance nobody had ever given him. He cried, actual tears. I watched them fall. The night I told him my father was skeptical, and he told me he understood, that he would step back if it would spare me any pain, that he had never expected someone like him to end up with someone like me. It took me 2 more years to understand that a man who cries on command is not a man in love. He is a man rehearsing. My father tried twice gently to slow things down. He hired a private investigator the month before the engagement was announced, and when the report came back, nothing damning, just a thin financial history, a mother with 2 prior small claims judgments against her from disgruntled flea market customers, a father who had quietly filed for a modest personal bankruptcy a decade earlier. My father set the folder on his desk and asked me, one more time, if I was certain. I told him he was being a snob. I told him love didn't come with a credit score. I told him that if he loved me, he would trust me to know my own heart. He signed the wedding invitations 3 weeks later. He walked me down the aisle in a chapel overlooking Lake Michigan, in a tuxedo he had tailored to hide the fact that he'd lost 12 pounds that spring from stress he never once mentioned to me. And he never brought up the private investigator's report again. Not once. Not even when the first signs of trouble started to surface 2 years into the marriage. Not even when Diane Callahan's brothers and sister began appearing on our company's payroll in departments where I, still naive, still convinced my new family only wanted the chance to prove themselves, personally vouched for their hiring. I understand now what that silence cost him. I understand now that a father who loves you enough to let you make your own catastrophic mistake is rarer and braver than a father who simply forbids you from making it. I unlocked my phone. My thumb moved without instruction, opening the photo gallery, scrolling through 5 years of images stacked like sediment. The wedding in a chapel garden strung with fairy lights, Derek feeding me soup from a ceramic bowl the week I had the flu, a Christmas morning with his entire extended family crowded into the great room of the estate. Every piece of furniture in that room paid for on my card. Every smile in that photograph now revealed to have been, on some level, a performance staged for an audience of one credulous woman. I had cherished these images once like small treasures. Now they were evidence of a crime scene I had lived inside, without recognizing it as one. Without letting myself hesitate, I selected all 5,312 photographs and pressed delete. The phone, with the calm indifference of a machine that cannot understand grief, asked me, "Are you sure you want to permanently delete these items?" I smiled, a small, bitter, exhausted smile, and I pressed confirm. The screen flashed once. 5 years of curated lies disappeared in under 2 seconds. It felt exactly like watching a surgeon excise a tumor. The cut is agony in the instant it happens. But if you let the tumor stay, it metastasizes, and eventually it kills you slower and worse. I scrolled to a contact saved simply as Dad. In the last 3 years, the number of times my father and I had spoken on the phone could be counted, almost literally, on one hand. Every call had been brief and stilted, a few clipped questions about my health, my schedule, whether I needed anything, followed swiftly by an excuse about a board meeting he had to get to. I knew why. He was not a man who yelled or lectured. He simply withdrew, the way water recedes from a wound it can no longer help. He was angry that I had spent 5 years defending a family that was quietly hollowing out the company he'd built from a single leased warehouse in 1988. He was angry that I had let them treat his life's work like a buffet. My finger hovered over the call button. I took one long breath, the kind that shakes on the way in, and pressed it. It rang 3 times. Then I heard a dry, familiar cough, and a voice that broke something loose in my chest before he had even finished my name. "Eleanor, honey." That was all it took. Every wall of pride I had been reinforcing for 5 years came down at once, silently, all in a rush, like a dam that had been cracking for a long time and finally gave. Hot tears rolled down my face before I could stop them. "Dad," I said, my voice already unraveling. I was wrong. I was so wrong. There was a pause on the line, a long, suspended silence in which I braced myself for the "I told you so that I felt honestly that I deserved." It never came. Instead, there was only a soft, tired exhale, the sound of a father setting down whatever armor he had been carrying for 3 years. "I know," he said quietly. "The decree came through today? This morning. Then cry, sweetheart. Cry it all the way out. I'm right here. This family is still right here. Nobody is ever going to touch you again." I put my forehead against the steering wheel and sobbed, the way I hadn't allowed myself to sob since I was 19 years old and standing at my mother's graveside. 5 years of resentment, humiliation, and swallowed grief came pouring out of me in the front seat of a parked car on a downtown Chicago street, and my father listened to every second of it without interrupting, offering only the occasional low hum of acknowledgement, the sound of a man absorbing pain on my behalf, so I wouldn't have to carry all of it alone. I told him everything. About Derek's affairs, plural, going back at least 3 years. About Diane's syrupy performances of humility that hid a woman quietly moving company funds through invoices no one else was allowed to review. About what Derek had said on the courthouse steps, that the roots ran too deep now, that pulling them out would bring the whole tree down. When I finally quieted, wiping my face with the back of my hand, my father's voice changed. It hardened, the way it must have hardened 1,000 times across 40 years of boardrooms and hostile negotiations, into the unmistakable register of the chairman who had built an empire out of a single leased warehouse and refused, for 4 decades, to let anyone take it from him. "The daughter of Charles Marsh," he said, "does not get taken down by a family of small-time flea market grifters. You've spent the morning cleaning your own house. Now it's time to clean the company." "You knew," I said, sitting up straight, wiping the last of the tears from my lashes. "This whole time. You knew what they were doing." "I've known for 2 years, almost to the month," my father said. "I have files, Eleanor. Bank records. Vendor contracts inflated 3 times over market rate. Shell corporations registered to addresses that turn out to be UPS mailboxes in Naperville. I've had our internal audit team building a case quietly since the quarter after Derek made COO, when the purchasing department's numbers stopped making sense to anyone who actually read them instead of just signing off on them." "Then why didn't you?" "Because you weren't ready to hear it," he said, gently but without apology. "And because I wasn't going to be the man who forced my daughter to choose between her husband and her father. I needed you to see it yourself. I needed you to be the one who pulled the thread, so that when it was finished, you'd know, really know, all the way down, that you did this. Not me. You." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift inside my chest, something between gratitude and a very specific kind of grief for the 3 years of silence I had mistaken for anger. He hadn't been punishing me. He had been waiting for me, patiently, the way you wait at the bottom of a long staircase for a child learning to walk down it alone. "I'll be at the office by 2 o'clock, I told him, and I heard my own voice come back fully into itself, cool and certain. The voice of a woman who had spent 5 years being underestimated and was done accepting the discount. "Have Thomas from HR ready. Have Gary from security ready. Before I set foot in that boardroom, every access credential belonging to Derek Callahan and every Callahan relative on our payroll needs to be frozen. Elevator cards deactivated. Server access revoked. All of it." "Done," my father said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I heard something like pride in his voice. "I'll have Daniel Reyes meet you there with the full file. Let's show them what greed actually costs." He hung up. I sat for a moment with the phone still in my hand, and then I called Daniel Reyes, our general counsel, a soft-spoken but relentless attorney who had been with Marsh Dynamics for 11 years and who, I would later learn, had spent the better part of the last 18 months quietly building the very case my father had just described. We agreed to meet at a private conference room on the 38th floor of Marsh Tower, 1 floor below the executive suite, at 1 o'clock, an hour before the ambush, enough time for him to walk me through exactly what we had and exactly how deep the rot went. When I arrived, Daniel was already there. 3 thick binders squared neatly on the table in front of him, his tie slightly loosened, the posture of a man who had been living inside this case for far longer than he'd ever let on to me. "Eleanor," he said, standing to shake my hand, an oddly formal gesture between 2 people who had known each other for years, but one that felt right for the occasion. This was no longer a family matter, it was a legal one, and he was treating it that way out of respect. "I want to walk you through this before you go up there, because once that door opens, there's no controlled version of this conversation anymore. It becomes public inside the building within the hour." He opened the first binder. Inside were photocopies of purchasing contracts signed by Roy Callahan, Diane's older brother, installed as director of procurement 18 months into my marriage. Line by line, Daniel showed me how raw material contracts, steel fasteners, industrial adhesives, packaging materials, had been quietly rerouted through a supplier called Ridgeline Fabrication Partners, a company that, on paper, looked like any other mid-sized vendor. In reality, Ridgeline had no factory, no warehouse, and a mailing address that traced back to a strip mall shipping store on the outskirts of Rockford. The markup on every contract averaged 62% above market rate. The difference, nearly $1.1 million over 3 years, had been wired in irregular increments into an account controlled by Sandra Callahan, Diane's sister, whom I had personally recommended for the role of assistant controller 3 years earlier because she'd told me, tearfully over Thanksgiving dinner, that she'd always dreamed of working somewhere she could really matter. "There's more," Daniel said, and turned to the second binder. This one detailed 3 limited liability companies registered under the name of Neil Callahan, Diane's youngest brother, Meridian Logistics Solutions, Falcon Creek Consulting, and Bright Path Facilities Group. None of the 3 had a single employee on record. None had ever filed a real invoice for services actually rendered. And yet, for nearly 3 years, Marsh Dynamics had been paying all 3 a combined average of $40,000 a month for what the internal ledgers vaguely described as operational support services. "Nearly $4 million, Daniel said quietly, closing the binder. "That's the conservative estimate. It could be higher once forensic accounting finishes the full trace. And that's before we even get to what Derek himself was doing with the client database in the final 6 months." I sat very still, absorbing the full architecture of what had been built around me, brick by brick, invoice by invoice, while I had been hosting charity luncheons and defending these people at dinner parties to friends who had tried, gently, to warn me. I thought of every moment over 5 years when Diane had squeezed my hand at a family gathering and told me how blessed she felt to have a daughter like me. I thought of every one of Derek's late nights at the office that I had assumed were dedication. 2 o'clock, I said finally, my voice steadier than I expected. "Let's go." It had been a very long time since I had walked into Marsh Tower in my capacity as heir rather than as the chairman's daughter dropping off a forgotten lunch. I wore a tailored black suit I hadn't touched in 3 years, my hair pinned back into a severe knot, my heels striking the polished granite of the lobby floor with a rhythm that felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely mine. The receptionists straightened in their chairs. A security guard near the turnstiles actually stood a little taller and murmured a startled, "Ms. Marsh," as I passed, as though the building itself recognized that something in the air had changed. I walked to the private executive elevator, swiped an all-access credential I had kept locked in the back of a drawer for 5 years, untouched, waiting, and rode it straight to the 40th floor without a single stop. Through the soundproofed glass wall of the executive boardroom, I could see the scene playing out inside before I ever opened the door. Diane Callahan sat in the vice chairman's leather chair, a seat she had no legal right to occupy, a seat Derek had simply started letting her use 18 months ago because, he'd told the board, she has good instincts for people. She wore a flashy crimson blazer and a strand of pearls the size of gumballs, laughing loudly with Roy and Sandra and 2 directors from what I now knew to be the shell corporations, the whole group looking like they were celebrating something. I nodded to Thomas Kwan, our VP of Human Resources, and to Gary Fenn, head of corporate security, both of whom stood waiting in the hallway with 6 additional security officers. Then, with one hand, I pushed the heavy oak doors open. They swung wide with a dry, heavy thud that cut every laugh in that room dead in an instant. Every head turned. Diane's smile froze on her face, then curdled into irritation as she registered who had interrupted her. "Eleanor, what on earth are you doing barging in like this? This is a leadership meeting. You are disrupting executive business. Whatever this is, it can wait until you're home." She was still performing the role of the doting mother-in-law, using seniority as a shield the way she always had. I didn't dignify it with a response. I walked, slowly and deliberately, to the head of the table, and I set down the 3 binders Daniel had shown me an hour earlier, letting them land with a heavy, unmistakable thud against the glass surface. Several of Diane's relatives jumped in their seats. "Diane," I said, "you seem to have forgotten something. In my house, you were my mother-in-law. In this building, I am the daughter of Charles Marsh, second largest shareholder of this corporation, and as of 11:40 this morning, your son and I have no legal relationship whatsoever." Diane rose halfway out of her chair, her face flushing red with the particular fury of a woman who has never once in her life been told no, and does not know what shape that word takes when it finally arrives. "What is this? Some kind of divorce tantrum? Derek hasn't said a word to me about any of this. You think because you have money you can just throw this family out into the street? Derek has been running this operation for years. Every vendor contract, every partner relationship, it's all in his hands. You push him out, this company falls apart within a quarter." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Whether this company falls apart is not your concern anymore, Diane. Thomas." Thomas Kwan stepped forward, opened the folder in his hands, and read in the clear, unhurried voice of a man who had worked alongside my father since the company's earliest days and had waited a long time to say these particular words out loud. "By order of the chairman of the board, and on the basis of documented evidence of financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty, Human Resources is announcing the immediate and indefinite suspension, effective as of 10:45 this morning, of Derek Callahan, Chief Operating Officer, Roy Callahan, Director of Procurement, Sandra Callahan, Assistant Controller, and 14 additional employees directly connected to the matter under investigation. All system credentials, banking access, and building entry privileges were revoked 15 minutes prior to this meeting. Additionally, all active contracts with the vendor's Ridgeline Fabrication Partners, Meridian Logistics Solutions, Falcon Creek Consulting, and Bright Path Facilities Group have been frozen pending a referral to federal investigators." Every word landed in that room like a hammer against glass. Diane's face drained from red to a sickly, bloodless gray. Her knees buckled slightly and she had to grip the armrest of her chair to keep from sliding out of it entirely. Roy and Sandra started fumbling for their phones, opening laptops that were already displaying red-bordered error messages where their credentials used to work. "You would do this to your own family," Diane hissed, jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. Every trace of her performed gentility gone, replaced by something raw and ugly. After everything we sacrificed, I leaned down until I was at her eye level and spoke slowly, so there could be no confusion about what I was saying. "I fed your family for 5 years. I clothed your grandchildren. I gave your brothers and sister jobs most people would kill for. That is called generosity, Diane. What you did in return, funneling company funds through shell corporations, inflating vendor contracts by 60%, paying your relatives salaries for services that were never performed, that has a different name. It's called embezzlement. It's called grand larceny, and it is no longer my problem to manage quietly. Gary, please have everyone without valid clearance escorted from the building. If anyone with the last name Callahan returns to Marsh Tower without written authorization, call the police for trespassing." 6 broad-shouldered security officers stepped forward, polite but immovable, gathering coats and phones and ushering Diane's relatives toward the door amid a rising chorus of protest and disbelief. I stood with my arms crossed, watching people who had spent 5 years quietly draining my family's company get herded out like a kicked hive of hornets, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. Not triumph, exactly, but relief. The specific relief of finally putting down a weight I had been carrying without realizing how heavy it had become. Everything I understood standing there in that boardroom was only just beginning. 2 days later, a sudden summer thunderstorm broke over the city, rain lashing sideways against the windows of a small coffee shop tucked into an alley off Wabash, a place Derek and I used to go when we were both broke graduate students and analysts, back when we still believed a shared cup of drip coffee and a shared future were the same thing. He was the one who had texted me, begging for one last meeting so he could apologize. My heart had gone cold enough by then that I felt almost nothing reading his message. But I went anyway, not because any part of me still hoped for reconciliation, but because I wanted, personally and permanently, to end whatever performance he still thought he could stage. I sat in the darkest corner booth, stirring a black coffee I had no intention of drinking, when the door chimed at exactly 4 o'clock, and Derek walked in. He looked nothing like the man who had strutted out of the courthouse in a Brioni suit 2 weeks earlier. His hair was unkempt, falling across his forehead. His dress shirt was wrinkled, half untucked. His eyes were sunken and red-rimmed, the eyes of a man who hadn't slept properly in days. He sat down across from me, hands clasped tightly on the table, shoulders trembling in a way that, a year ago, would have sent me rushing around the table to hold him. Now I just watched. A stranger performing grief for an audience that no longer believed a word of it. "Eleanor, I was wrong," he said, his voice hoarse, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. He reached for my hand. I pulled it back before he could touch me, and something in my expression must have registered, because he flinched. Getting frozen out of the company, it woke me up. Paige, she was just after the money. The second she realized I had nothing left, she packed up everything I'd bought her and left with some guy from a hedge fund. I know I'm a terrible person, Eleanor. I betrayed your trust. I betrayed your father's trust. But we were married 5 years. We built a life. I'm asking you, beg your dad to give me one more shot. I don't need a title. I'll take any job. Just let me stay near you and make this right." I let him finish. The corner of my mouth curled upward into something that was not a smile so much as the ghost of one. "There really is no floor to how shameless people can get," I said quietly. I reached into my bag, pulled out a small digital voice recorder and a slim manila folder, and slid both across the table toward him. "Wipe your face, Derek. There's no camera in here. Nobody's handing out an award for this performance." I pressed play. Paige's voice came through the tiny speaker first, playful and self-satisfied, layered under the low hum of a bar somewhere. "You've been on fire lately, babe, squeezing that mansion out of the old bag like that. Once we finish gutting the company, we can just move to the coast. Start fresh." Then Derek's own voice, unmistakable, warm with the exact tone he used to use with me in our first year of marriage. "Don't worry about Eleanor. She's too stupid to see it. She's so wrapped up in me she does whatever I tell her. Her old man's basically checked out at this point. I already copied the full client database off the internal servers onto one of my mother's shell accounts. Once this last deal closes, I'm done with her. I'll bring you home like a queen." The recording ended. The rain hammered against the window. Derek's face went from flushed to bone white in the space of a single breath. His lips moved without producing sound. He grabbed the folder with shaking hands and flipped it open. Screenshots of text messages coordinating the transfer of proprietary client data. Wire transfer records showing money moved from 3 separate project accounts into a personal account under his name. "For 5 years," I said, leaning forward, keeping my voice level even as every word landed like a blade. "I loved you enough to defy my own father. I ignored your mother's greed. I let your relatives take jobs that belonged to people who actually needed them. And in return, I didn't just get infidelity. I got a coordinated plan to steal my family's company out from under us. Do you really think a few tears at a coffee shop table undo corporate fraud and grand larceny? A copy of this file is already with federal investigators. The divorce was step 1, Derek. Where you and your family belong now is behind bars." He stood up so fast his chair slammed against the wall behind him, all traces of the weeping, penitent man gone, replaced by the panic of someone finally understanding the size of the hole he'd dug. "You'd really do this? Destroy me completely? What kind of woman does that to the man she married?" I stood, calm, and left 2 20s on the table for coffee neither of us had touched. "Society's opinion doesn't pay my bills, Derek, and it certainly won't keep me up at night. But if I let a man who tried to gut my family's company walk away with an apology and a hug, that's a sin I'm not willing to commit against my father. Hire a lawyer. My attorneys will be in touch." I walked out into the rain, and the cold water on my face felt, strangely, like relief. The following morning, while I sat in my new office reviewing a stack of contracts that had been quietly neglected during the chaos of the past week, my phone rang. Daniel Reyes's name lit up the screen, and his voice, when I answered, was steady, but carried the particular weight of news that changes the shape of a day. "Eleanor, last night Derek broke back into headquarters using a backup key card that hadn't been fully deactivated. He was attempting to copy the core client database onto an external drive. Security caught him on camera and in person. He's been formally charged with corporate espionage and theft of trade secrets. The evidence is airtight." I set my pen down on the desk and leaned back in the leather chair that had, until recently, belonged to men who had underestimated me at every turn. I let out a long breath. He simply could not accept that it was over. He was still thrashing in the pit he had dug for himself, still convinced that greed and charm could talk his way out of consequences the way they always had before. He had never learned, nobody in that family had ever learned, the one truth that governs every fortune, honest or stolen. Anything you did not build with your own hands, you cannot keep. Derek's future, from that point forward, would be measured in visiting hours and appeal dates rather than boardroom meetings. But the unraveling of the Callahan family did not stop with him. That same afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. On the other end was the halting, deferential voice of Walter Callahan, Derek's father. A man who, in 5 years of marriage, I had probably spoken to fewer than a dozen times. Unlike Diane, who was loud and grasping, Walter had spent his life as a quiet high school history teacher in Rockford, the kind of man who kept his head down, protected his modest reputation, and had vanished entirely from view the moment the scandal broke, never once appearing publicly to defend his wife or his son. "Eleanor, it's Walter. I wanted to call and apologize, to you and to Mr. Marsh." His voice wavered, thick with a very specific kind of humiliation. "I spent 31 years teaching children how this country is supposed to work, and I never imagined I'd end up with a son and a wife who did the opposite of everything I tried to model for my students. I filed for divorce from Diane this morning. I've asked the court to separate my pension and the small house in Rockford so none of it gets frozen along with whatever the federal investigators find. I have no further connection to either of them. I only ask, if you're able, that you not make any of this public in a way that reaches my old school. I'd like to keep some small piece of dignity in front of my neighbors." Listening to those quiet, self-protective excuses, I felt something that was not quite sympathy but adjacent to it. Pity, maybe, for an entire idea of family that had rotted from the inside for so long nobody left standing in it even recognized what a real one was supposed to look like. When there had been money and status to enjoy, everyone had crowded in close. Now that the roof was coming down, the man who was supposed to be its foundation stepped calmly out from underneath it to save his pension and what remained of his ego. "Walter," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "The law is fair to everyone, and it won't chase down people who didn't break it. I hope that once this settles, you find something real, Not the kind of peace you get from walking away from your family the moment it becomes inconvenient, but something you've actually earned. I hung up, closing the final open door between myself and the Callahans, and turned back to the mountain of work still waiting on my desk. The late summer heat still hung heavy over the granite plaza in front of Marsh Tower the following Monday morning. At exactly 8 o'clock, the hour when thousands of employees stream through the revolving doors to swipe their badges, a chaotic crowd came pouring across the plaza, shattering the usual brisk professional rhythm of the morning. Leading them was Diane Callahan, flanked by 24 Callahan relatives of every age, all dressed in deliberately shabby clothes, a stark contrast to the designer labels they'd been wearing just weeks earlier. They carried hand-lettered cardboard signs in bright red and yellow. Marsh Dynamics robs working families. Billionaires crush the little guy. Give us back our justice. A cheap battery-powered megaphone crackled and squealed as Diane wailed into it, joined by a chorus of theatrical sobbing from several of the Callahan women, turning the plaza into a small, ugly circus. Commuters slowed their cars. Pedestrians pulled out their phones to film. Within 20 minutes, a full lane of traffic on Wacker Drive was backed up. Gary Fenn, sweating through his collar, radioed up to my office asking permission to call the police and clear the plaza. I watched the scene unfold on the security monitors from the 40th floor, arms crossed, a small, cold smile settling on my face. "Gary, don't call the police yet," I said into the radio. "Open the main doors. Invite the entire group into the lobby. Have bottled water brought out for them. We're going to handle this in the open, in front of our employees and anyone else who wants to watch." When I stepped off the elevator into the grand lobby a few minutes later, the Callahan crowd had already spilled across the leather sofas meant for visiting clients, several of them still shouting slurs loud enough to make the security desk staff wince. A few of the younger relatives looked uneasy the moment they saw me in my tailored suit, but Diane charged straight at me, finger jabbing toward my face. "You vicious, ungrateful girl. My family broke our backs for this company for years, and now you throw us all out onto the street with nothing. Today, the whole city is going to know exactly what kind of people run Marsh Dynamics." I stood with my hands folded behind my back, letting her scream herself hoarse in front of a gathering ring of curious employees, some frowning in confusion, others in open disdain at the spectacle. When Diane finally paused to catch her breath, I spoke, my voice carrying clearly through a small lapel microphone that fed into the lobby's sound system. "Diane, you say your family sacrificed and worked itself to the bone here. Wonderful. Since everyone is gathered and since half the city is filming this on their phones, let's show them exactly what that sacrifice looked like." I raised a hand. Behind me, the massive digital display normally used for investor presentations flickered to life, filling with scanned bank statements, notarized contracts, and forensic accounting summaries. I held a small remote and clicked through the slides one by one, narrating each in a voice that carried, flat and clear, across the stunned lobby. "This is a procurement contract signed by Roy Callahan, Diane's brother, our former director of purchasing. Raw material costs were inflated to more than double market rate. The difference, $1.1 million, as confirmed by this bank record Ishars, was routed directly into a personal account belonging to Sandra Callahan, Diane's sister, our former assistant controller." A wave of gasps rippled through the lobby, followed almost immediately by a low, furious murmur among the gathered employees. Diane's face drained from red to a sick, waxy gray. Her knees wobbled and she gripped her brother Roy's sleeve to keep from sinking to the floor. Roy himself had gone pale, sweat beading visibly along his hairline. I clicked forward. "I'm not finished. Here are 3 shell corporations registered to Neil Callahan, Diane's youngest brother. No office, no employees. And yet, every month for nearly 3 years, these three companies received substantial payments from Marsh Dynamics for services that were never performed. The total embezzled from this company by the Callahan family over the last 3 years comes to nearly $4 million. Did you honestly believe cardboard signs and a megaphone were going to bury the fact that you stole from thousands of honest employees who actually earn their paychecks here? As the Callahan relatives began to panic, some backing toward the doors, others frantically whispering to each other, the sound of sirens rose from the street outside. Squad cars pulled up hard against the curb. Federal investigators and uniformed officers strode into the lobby carrying stacks of warrants, and the lead detective read the charges aloud in a booming voice that silenced the entire room. Grand larceny, embezzlement, and corporate fraud against Roy Callahan, Sandra Callahan, and Neil Callahan. The click of handcuffs closing around the wrists of people who, moments earlier, had been shouting about justice, was the only sound in the lobby for several long seconds. The relatives who had carried the protest signs let them clatter to the marble floor and scattered toward the exits. Pale and silent, the fight completely drained out of them. Diane watched her own siblings get led away in restraints. Her eyes rolled back slightly, her legs finally gave out entirely, and she collapsed onto the cold marble floor, wailing in a voice too broken to form actual words. Nobody in that lobby offered her so much as a hand to help her up. Her own bottomless greed had dug the grave, now swallowing the rest of her family, one relative at a time. My father's estate on the North Shore usually held a rare quiet even on the hottest afternoons, the kind of peace that comes from mature oak trees and a lawn maintained by the same groundskeeper for 20 years. Bougainvillea bloomed along the stone wall in a riot of pink and orange. That peace was violently shattered 2 days later. Unwilling to accept that her siblings were now in federal custody and her son was facing serious charges of his own, Diane turned to the most despicable tool she had left, her own grandchildren. She dragged Neil's two young kids, 10-year-old Ethan and 6-year-old Lily, to the wrought iron gates of the estate under the full weight of the afternoon sun, forced them to kneel on the scorching pavement, and hung hand-scrawled cardboard signs around each small neck. Grandpa Charles, Aunt Eleanor, please forgive our family. She crouched beside them, pinching the backs of their legs whenever their crying softened, trying to keep the performance loud enough to draw the attention of passing neighbors. I watched the scene unfold on the estate's security monitors, sitting beside my father in the living room, and felt something sharp and nauseating twist through my chest. What kind of woman drags her own grandchildren into the blistering heat and uses them as human shields for her own crimes? My father gripped his cane, veins standing out along the back of his hand, his face reddening with a fury I had rarely seen in him. He drew a long breath, rose slowly, and spoke in the flat, unshakable tone of a man who had survived 4 decades of corporate warfare without once raising his voice unnecessarily. Eleanor, open the gates. They brought this to our front door. The Marsh family doesn't hide from anything. Even a tiger doesn't eat its own cubs. If a person can sink this low, there's nothing left in them worth protecting. The gate swung open. A small cluster of neighbors had already gathered along the sidewalk, murmuring and pointing. My father walked out ahead of me, thin but upright, moving with the steady, deliberate gait of a much younger man. He didn't spare Diane, sprawled theatrically on the pavement, a single glance. He walked straight to the 2 children, crouched down with visible effort, and placed a trembling hand on Lily's small shoulder before turning to look directly into Ethan's eyes. "Diane," he said without turning around, his voice suddenly a thunderclap that silenced the entire street. "Get up off the ground." Diane flinched, startled out of her performance, and looked up at him with red, swollen eyes. My father struck the tip of his cane against the pavement. Because of your greed, because of money you stole, you have the audacity to drag 2 children out here and make them kneel like this is something they did wrong? Who exactly are they begging forgiveness from? The crimes your son and your siblings committed will be judged by the courts. These children have done nothing. They are not a shield for your cowardice. Diane sputtered, grasping for the last scraps of authority she could muster in front of a growing audience of neighbors filming on their phones. You're the cruel one. My grandchildren are losing their father. My whole family is destroyed. And it's because your daughter is a jealous, heartless. You people are cold. Before she could finish, something happened that stunned everyone standing on that sidewalk, my father included. Ethan, usually the quiet, withdrawn kid I remembered from a handful of family gatherings, stood up on his own. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, but his eyes held something fierce and clear that no 10-year-old should have had to summon on his own. He looked at the neighbors recording on their phones, then down at the cardboard sign hanging from his own neck. With a sudden, furious motion, he grabbed the string with both hands, snapped it, and hurled the sign to the ground, stomping on it once. "Grandma, stop making me kneel," he said, his voice cracking but carrying clearly across the silent street. "I'm so embarrassed." He turned, took his little sister's hand, pulled the sign from around her neck too, and threw it aside. Then he looked up at Diane with an expression of bottomless, wounded disappointment that seemed far too old for his face. "My teacher says if you do something wrong, you have to take responsibility for it. Dad did something wrong. He has to deal with it. You told me coming here would fix things, but it doesn't fix anything. It just makes it worse." He gripped Lily's hand and walked the two of them away down the sidewalk, small, but somehow entirely unbreakable, their shadows stretching long across the pavement in the late sun. Diane stood frozen, covering her face, sobbing in a delayed, bitter regret that came too late to mean anything. Her final gambit, using 2 children's dignity to manufacture sympathy, had just been dismantled by her own 10-year-old grandson in front of a street full of witnesses. My father watched the children until they disappeared around the corner, his eyes glistening. He let out a long breath, turned, and walked back inside without another word, leaving Diane alone in the wreckage of a scheme that had failed in the cruelest, most instructive way possible. The curious crowd of neighbors had barely begun to disperse after Ethan and Lily disappeared down the block when a passenger van screeched to a stop at the curb outside the estate. Frank Callahan, Derek's uncle, freshly fired from his position in project management that same morning, climbed out first, followed by nearly a dozen other relatives, their faces flushed with a rage that had nothing performative left in it. No more of the fawning deference they'd shown Diane for years. Frank stormed up to where Diane still sat crumpled near the gate and jabbed a finger down at her. "Diane, what the hell did you do? This morning half the family was sitting at our desks like normal, and suddenly security's packing up our things and walking us out the door like we're criminals. They're saying your side of the family embezzled and committed fraud. What is going on? You told us to come work here so we could all finally get a piece of something good, and now we've lost our jobs. How exactly are you going to fix this?" Diane scrambled unsteadily to her feet, her clothes rumpled, mascara streaked down both cheeks, trying to salvage whatever authority remained to her as the matriarch of the family. "Frank, calm down, we'll figure this out. It's Eleanor. She's punishing all of us because she's bitter about the divorce. I'm panicking too. 3 of my own siblings got arrested by federal agents an hour ago. How dare you come here and yell at me right now?" One of Derek's aunts, a wiry, sharp-eyed woman named Carla, cut her off with a contemptuous laugh. "Bitter? Stop lying to us, Diane. This morning they put actual bank statements up on a screen in that lobby. Millions of dollars in fake vendor markups. Shell companies with nobody working at them. You and your siblings swallowed every dollar of it whole. Did the rest of us at the bottom ever see a single cent? We stood there as your human shield for years, and now that it's collapsed, you want the rest of us to take the fall with you? At the mention of millions of dollars, the entire group erupted into furious shouting, a decade of forced family unity dissolving in a matter of seconds. Whatever loyalty had bound this extended family together had never really been loyalty at all. It had been proximity to money, and the moment the money disappeared, so did every pretense of affection. Frank grabbed a fistful of Diane's blazer, his jaw tight with fury. Pay us back what we're owed. My whole family moved to this city because of that job. My kids' school, our mortgage, all of it depended on that paycheck. And now my background checks flagged for federal fraud investigation just because I share your last name. Who's going to hire me now? You swallowed millions. You're going to pay us for the damage you caused. Or I swear to God, I'll make sure everyone in this state knows exactly what you did. I watched all of it unfold from the second-floor balcony of my father's house, arms crossed, feeling nothing that resembled satisfaction, only the bleak recognition of what happens to people whose entire value system runs on greed the moment the gold runs out. These were people who had spent years bleeding my family dry together, and now, cut off from the source, they were prepared to tear each other apart with the same efficiency. Derek stood off to one side near the gate, visibly shrinking, his face pale as he watched relatives he'd always considered beneath him turn savage in front of the whole street. Whatever wealth and status he'd schemed so hard to steal had already burned to ash, taking the last threads of his family's loyalty with it. The chaos showed no sign of stopping, Diane's wails tangling with Frank's furious shouting into something almost unbearable to listen to. I took a breath, adjusted my jacket, and walked down the stairs. My father sat calmly in the living room, a half-finished cup of tea in his hands, and gave me a slow nod, the kind that told me he trusted me completely to handle what came next. I had Gary open the gates again, this time facing directly into the middle of the shouting match. My presence stopped the crowd cold. The hands gripping Diane's collar loosened and fell away. I stepped onto the porch, sweeping my gaze slowly across the haggard, frightened faces gathered on the driveway, and spoke in a voice that wasn't loud, but carried enough weight to end the argument on its own. Are you finished? This is private property. I have every legal right to have police remove all of you for trespassing and disturbing the peace. But given our history, I'm going to offer you one chance to end this quietly. I looked past Derek's panicked face and locked eyes with Frank. I know most of you standing here had nothing to do with the embezzlement Diane and her 3 siblings orchestrated. You were used as cover, the same way I was. Marsh Dynamics runs on rules, but it also runs on basic decency. For anyone who broke no laws, I will personally instruct HR to pay out this month's full salary along with legal severance, and the company will issue clean letters of recommendation so you can find new positions elsewhere. I let that sink in for a moment before delivering the second half. That offer is only good for people who leave this property right now and cut all ties permanently with anyone currently under federal investigation. If you'd rather stay here and defend Diane, that's your choice. But tomorrow morning, your employment files go straight to federal investigators as part of an expanded inquiry into possible accomplices. It didn't take 10 seconds for Frank to start backing away, hands raised. Ms. Marsh, if that's the deal, we're taking it. We didn't know anything. We swear. We're leaving right now. He herded the rest of the relatives back into the van without a single one of them looking back at Diane. The van pulled away in a cloud of exhaust, leaving a chilling silence on the driveway. Diane sat slumped on the pavement, staring blankly at the van as it disappeared, muttering incoherent fragments to herself like a woman who had just watched her entire world collapse in real time. It was Derek who finally stepped forward to help his mother up, but instead of comfort, his voice was thick with resentment. You see what you did, Mom? I told you to keep it small. I told you not to bring the whole family into the company. You had to have everything. Now it's blown up. I lost Eleanor. I lost my job. And you lost every dollar you stole. You ruined my life. Do you understand that? Diane froze, staring at the son she had always been so proud of, and something in her finally snapped. She swung her arm with the full force of years of pent-up desperation and slapped him hard across the face, the sound cracking sharply across the driveway, leaving a bright red imprint on his cheek. "You ungrateful child!" she screamed. "What do you think I did all of this for? To build you your own company someday. To keep that girl of yours in designer purses. And now you turn around and blame all of it on me?" Her cries echoed across the quiet street, closing the curtain on a family that had shared a roof, but never a genuine bond. A family finally turning its claws on itself now that there was nothing left to steal. That night, after the last of the Callahans had driven off and my father had gone to bed early, exhausted in the particular way that only comes after a day of holding your spine straight through pure will, I drove back into the city alone. I didn't go to my apartment. I went, instead, to the mansion, the 6-bedroom colonial in Winnetka that Derek and I had bought during our 3rd year of marriage, the one where I had personally selected and paid for every stick of furniture, every custom drape, every hand-laid tile in the kitchen backsplash. I let myself in with a key I still hadn't returned and stood in the dark foyer for a long time without turning on the lights. The house smelled the way it always had, cedar and lemon polish. The housekeeper's doing, not mine. I walked slowly through the rooms, running my hand along the back of the leather sofa Derek had insisted on, the dining table where his relatives had once crowded in for a Thanksgiving, where 3 separate people at that table had, I now knew, been actively stealing from my family in the same calendar year they'd said grace over turkey I had paid for. I thought about all the nights I had lain awake in the primary bedroom upstairs, listening for the garage door, telling myself Derek's absence meant dedication rather than betrayal. I thought about how much of myself I had poured into making this house feel like a home for 2 people, when only one of us had ever actually lived in it honestly. Standing in the dark kitchen, I made a decision that felt less like grief and more like exhaling after holding my breath for 5 years. I was going to sell the house. Not out of spite, not to erase Derek from my history. I didn't need to erase him. The courts and the federal government were doing a thorough enough job of that on their own. But because I no longer wanted to live inside a monument to my own naivety. I wanted walls that hadn't absorbed 5 years of lies. I wanted a kitchen where nobody had ever lied to me over dinner. I called a realtor the next morning, a brisk, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Nolan, who had sold half the North Shore at some point in her career, and told her I wanted the house listed within the month, furniture and all, minus a small handful of items that had been my mother's before they were ever mine. Patricia didn't ask a single question about why. She simply said, "I'll have someone out this week," in a tone that told me she had done this exact kind of transaction for exact kind of woman more times than either of us needed to discuss. I moved into a modern 2-bedroom condo downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, a space entirely mine, furnished slowly and deliberately over the following months with things I actually liked, rather than things that photographed well for other people's approval. It was smaller than anything I'd lived in since childhood. It was also, for the first time in 5 years, quiet in a way that didn't feel lonely. It felt like my own. I thought foolishly that the worst of it was behind me. I was wrong. 3 weeks after the boardroom purge, while I was still working 18-hour days trying to stabilize the departments the Callahans had gutted, my assistant forwarded me an email with the subject line, "Time-sensitive FIL, regarding Derek Callahan and your family." The sender was a name I recognized instantly, Paige Sutton. The email was short, almost businesslike in its cruelty. Paige claimed she was pregnant with Derek's child, that she had documents proving the affair had started earlier than anyone realized, specifically that it predated my marriage by several months, meaning Derek had been unfaithful before we ever exchanged vows. A detail she seemed to think would be devastating enough to leak to a local gossip blog that covered Chicago's wealthier families with the breathless enthusiasm of a tabloid. Attached to the email was a blurry screenshot of a text conversation and a grainy photo of a positive pregnancy test held in a hand I couldn't confirm was even hers. Her ask was simple: $200,000, wired within the week, or the story. Dressed up with just enough salacious detail to make it irresistible to click, would go to 3 different local media outlets and every gossip account that covered Chicago's business elite. I sat with the email for a long moment, feeling something that surprised me. Not fear, not even real anger, but a kind of tired, clinical curiosity about how far people were willing to go once they'd convinced themselves the rules didn't apply to them. I forwarded the email to Daniel Reyes without comment. He called me back within 20 minutes. "This is textbook extortion, Eleanor. Attempted extortion, wire fraud if she actually accepts payment across state lines, and if the pregnancy claim is fabricated, which, frankly, given everything else we know about her, I'd bet it is, she's also exposing herself to fraud charges on top of it. Do you want to pay this to make it tight and cropped to remove the watermark, sloppily enough that reverse image search found the original within an hour?" The relationship timeline she'd claimed, that Derek had been unfaithful before our wedding, was contradicted by her own social media history, which showed her still dating someone else, a bartender in Wicker Park, 4 months after my wedding date. Rather than pay her a single dollar, Daniel drafted a response letter, CCing a federal investigator already assigned to the broader Callahan case, laying out precisely what Paige had attempted, along with the fabricated evidence used to attempt it. He gave her 48 hours to retract her claims in writing or face a criminal referral for attempted extortion, which, given her recent proximity to a man already facing federal fraud charges, was not a risk any competent person would take lightly. Paige folded within 6 hours. Her retraction, when it came, was groveling and pathetic, insisting she'd made a mistake and had no intention of following through, a claim that rang about as true as everything else that had come out of her mouth since I'd met her on a courthouse plaza. Daniel filed it away in case it was ever needed again and moved on. I never heard from her after that. I remember sitting at my desk after the whole matter resolved, looking out at the skyline through my office window, and thinking about how strange it was that I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, no particular vindication. It was simply one more piece of debris cleared from a house I was still, slowly, learning to rebuild. There would always be people willing to try to take advantage of a moment of visible vulnerability. The only real defense, I was learning, was refusing to be quiet about it. By the time the leaves along Michigan Avenue had started to turn, the worst of the legal chaos had settled into a slow, grinding process of depositions and discovery that would occupy attorneys on both sides for the better part of a year. Derek's espionage and fraud charges were moving toward trial. Roy, Sandra, and Neil had all accepted plea deals rather than risk a jury, each of them agreeing to restitution schedules that would take most of a decade to complete, assuming they ever managed to find employment again that paid enough to make a dent in it. Diane had not been criminally charged. Her signature, cleverly, appeared on almost nothing directly. But the civil suit Marsh Dynamics filed against her personally for facilitating and directing the fraud was, according to Daniel, about as close to a slam dunk as these things get. My father called a full board meeting in October, the first one in nearly 2 years, where every seat at the table would be filled by someone who had actually earned their place there. He opened the meeting not with a financial report, but with an announcement that caught me completely off guard. "Effective this quarter," he said, looking directly at me down the length of the mahogany table. "I am appointing my daughter, Eleanor Marsh, as co-chief executive officer of Marsh Dynamics, with full operational authority effective immediately, and a clear path to the sole chairmanship upon my retirement, which I intend to formalize within the next 18 months. I hadn't been warned. I sat there for a moment, feeling the entire room's attention settle on me, a mixture of surprise and, from board members who had known me since I was a teenager attending my first shareholder meeting in a stiff dress my mother had picked out, something that looked almost like relief. "I built this company from a single leased warehouse because I refused to let anyone else decide what I was capable of," my father continued. "For 5 years, my daughter let people underestimate her because she believed loyalty and love were the same thing. She has spent the last 2 months proving, decisively, that she is capable of running this business with more discipline and more clarity than most people who have held that title for decades. I trust her with this company because she has already shown me, under fire, exactly the kind of leader she is." I gave a short acceptance speech I hadn't prepared. Something about earning trust rather than assuming it, about how the last 5 years had taught me more about human nature and about myself than any MBA program ever could, and about my intention to spend my tenure building a culture at Marsh Dynamics where nepotism could never again quietly calcify into theft. The board approved the appointment unanimously. My first order of business as co-CEO was not glamorous. I spent the following weeks personally reviewing every vendor contract signed in the last 5 years, cross-referencing every hire made during my marriage against actual qualifications and actual performance reviews, quietly correcting a system that had rewarded proximity to Derek and Diane over competence for far too long. I promoted Thomas Kwan to Chief Human Resources Officer, a role he'd essentially been performing without the title for a decade. I gave Gary Fenn's security division a direct reporting line to the board, rather than to operations, closing the exact loophole that had let a compromised COO quietly keep his own keycards active long after they should have been revoked. And I brought in an outside audit firm to conduct a full forensic review of every department the Callahans had touched, a process that would ultimately recover, over the following year, close to $2.6 million in misdirected funds. Not everything that had been taken, but enough to feel, finally, like the bleeding had stopped. Through all of it, there was one person who had never once told me she'd seen this coming. Never once said, "I told you so," even though she absolutely could have. Maggie Delgado had been my roommate at Northwestern, and in the years since, my closest friend. One of the few people from my old life who had never asked me for a single favor, a job, or an introduction to my father. She worked as a pediatric nurse at Lurie Children's Hospital, lived in a modest 2-bedroom in Logan Square with her husband and their twin boys, and had watched, mostly in patient, worried silence, as I disappeared for 5 years into a marriage she had quietly disliked from the very first dinner she'd shared with Derek. We met for dinner at a small Italian place in her neighborhood the week after the board meeting, a place with red checkered tablecloths and a bartender who knew her order without asking. She waited until we were most of the way through a bottle of Chianti before she finally said what I think she'd been holding on to for years. "I hated him from the first night I met him," she said, twisting her wine glass slowly by the stem. "Not because he wasn't charming. He was very charming. That was exactly the problem. Nobody needs to work that hard to be charming unless they're compensating for something they don't want you to notice." "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I asked, not accusingly, just genuinely curious. I did, actually. Twice. You don't remember because you weren't in a place to hear it. The second time, you told me I was jealous because I'd married a pediatric resident instead of a corporate executive, and that stuck with me for a long time, if I'm being honest. I stopped bringing it up after that. I figured you'd find your own way to the truth eventually, and I didn't want to be the friend you cut off along the way there. I felt a small, sharp pang of shame at the memory. I did remember saying something like that, in the defensive, brittle way people say cruel things when they're protecting an illusion they've already started to suspect is cracking. I'm sorry, I said. That wasn't fair to you. You don't need to apologize for surviving something, Maggie said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. You need to apologize for the year you spent being insufferable about it, which frankly, you just did. So we're square. She grinned, and something in my chest finally loosened after weeks of held tension. I'm proud of you, Eleanor. Genuinely. Not because you took the company back. Though good for you, obviously. Because you didn't disappear into bitterness. You could have. God knows you'd have earned the right to, but you came out of it sharper, not smaller. We talked for another 2 hours about nothing important. Her boy's upcoming school play, a nurse at her hospital she suspected was dating a resident against every rule in the handbook, whether I'd finally consider dating again someday, a question I deflected with a laugh but privately turned over for the rest of that night. It was the first evening in longer than I could remember where I laughed without a single ounce of performance behind it, where nobody in the conversation wanted anything from me except my company. Walking home along the river afterward, the city lights scattered across the water like something out of a postcard, I thought about how much of the last 5 years I had spent surrounded by people and still, somehow, profoundly alone. Maggie had been the one constant, quietly waiting on the sidelines the whole time, never asking for anything, never pretending to be anything other than exactly who she was. I made a private promise to myself, walking along that river, that I would never again let the noise of people who wanted something from me drown out the quieter, steadier voices of the people who simply wanted good things for me. The story, inevitably, made its way into the local business press. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune's business desk had been quietly working a piece for weeks, once word leaked that federal charges had been filed against 3 former Marsh Dynamics executives, and by the time she called my office requesting comment, most of the broad strokes were already public record through court filings. I made the decision, against the advice of at least one board member who preferred silence, to speak with her directly rather than let the story get told entirely through unnamed sources and secondhand gossip. We met at a conference room on the 39th floor. The reporter, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renata Ford, who had covered Chicago corporate scandals for over a decade, recording our conversation with a small device set neatly between us on the table. There's a version of this story, Renata said, where you're just a wealthy woman who got embarrassed by her ex-husband's family and used her father's money to crush them. I assume you'd like to offer a different version. I'd like to offer the true version, I said, which is that a family used a 5-year marriage as cover to embezzle nearly $4 million from a company that employs almost 4,000 people across 6 states. Every single one of the criminal charges in this case came from a federal investigation, not from me settling a personal score. I didn't press charges because my feelings were hurt. I pressed charges because ignoring what happened would have meant deciding that some employees' retirement funds and job security mattered less than my own discomfort about admitting I'd been deceived. Renata asked, not unkindly, whether I had any regrets about how publicly the confrontation in the company lobby had played out, given that 2 children had briefly been part of the spectacle outside my father's estate, footage of which had already circulated on social media by the time we sat down together. My only regret, I told her, is that it took me 5 years to see clearly enough to protect the people around me, including, frankly, 2 children who never should have been dragged into any of this by their own grandmother. I don't think there's a version of accountability that doesn't occasionally look uncomfortable from the outside. I'd rather it look uncomfortable and be honest than look tidy and let people keep getting hurt quietly, the way I was, for years, because nobody wanted to make a scene. The piece ran 2 weeks later under the headline, "The Reckoning at Marsh Dynamics: How One Family's Greed Nearly Sank a Chicago Institution." It was, by the standards of business journalism, fair, more interested in the mechanics of the fraud and the broader lesson about unchecked nepotism in family-run companies than in salacious personal details, though it did note, with what I chose to interpret as restrained sympathy, that I had declined to comment on her personal feelings regarding her former husband, stating only that the company's employees deserved more of her attention than her own grievances did. I read the piece once, at my desk, late in the evening after most of the floor had emptied out, and felt something I hadn't expected. A quiet, settled sense of having told the truth, publicly, on my own terms, rather than letting it be told about me by someone else. For 5 years, I had let other people write the story of my life, Derek with his affairs, Diane with her schemes, even my own father, in his well-intentioned silence. This was, in a small but real way, the first chapter I had written entirely myself. Winter came early that year, the way it sometimes does in Chicago, the lake wind turning bitter by the first week of November. I threw myself into work in the way I imagine people throw themselves into physical training after an injury. Not to avoid feeling the pain of what had happened, but because rebuilding something with my own hands, one contract and one hire and one policy change at a time, was the only thing that made the last 5 years feel like they had produced something other than loss. I restructured the procurement department entirely, instituting a rule that no employee could directly supervise a family member without a secondary layer of independent financial review, a policy so basic it embarrassed me that Marsh Dynamics hadn't already had one. I sat in on interviews personally for the first 6 months, not because I didn't trust our hiring managers, but because I wanted, for my own peace of mind, to be certain that every new person walking through our doors was there because of what they could do, not who they were related to. I started running again, something I'd let slide during the marriage because Derek used to make small, needling comments about how intense I looked when I trained for a half marathon 2 years into our relationship, comments I'd absorbed at the time as playful and only later recognized as a quiet, persistent effort to shrink me down to a size that made him more comfortable. I ran along the lakefront path most mornings before work that winter, the cold burning in my lungs, and found that the sharper the wind, the clearer my head felt by the time I reached my desk. I did not, contrary to what Maggie kept gently hoping out loud over dinner every few weeks, rush back into dating. I went on exactly 2 dates that entire winter, both arranged through mutual acquaintances, both perfectly pleasant and entirely unremarkable, and I turned down a third with a kind but oddly persistent architect because some quiet, newly protective instinct in me recognized, almost immediately, the particular flavor of a man who complimented my ambition a little too enthusiastically in a first conversation. I had learned, the hard way, what performed admiration sounds like when it's covering for something else. I wasn't in a hurry to relearn that lesson. My father, for his part, seemed to grow visibly younger that autumn, in the way people sometimes do when a weight they've been quietly carrying for years finally gets set down. He came into the office 3 days a week instead of 5, spent more afternoons at the house working through the crossword with a cup of black coffee, and started, for the first time since my mother died, mentioning her name in conversation without his voice catching on it. He told me once, over a quiet Sunday dinner in December, that watching me take back the company had felt, in some strange way, like getting a piece of her back too, that she would have recognized something of herself in the way I'd handled the whole ordeal. Calm and precise, rather than vengeful, protecting the people who deserved protecting and holding accountable, without flinching, the people who didn't. Your mother never raised her voice in her life, he told me, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. Not once, not even when she was furious. She used to say that anger loses its power the moment you let it get loud. You get that from her. I used to worry, when you were young, that you'd inherited my temper instead. I'm glad I was wrong. Derek's trial came in the spring, nearly 10 months after the day I'd stood on the courthouse steps holding a decree that felt weightless in my hand and impossibly heavy in my chest all at once. I hadn't planned to attend every day of it. Daniel had advised against it, worried the defense might try to paint my presence as vindictive theater for the jury. But I went on the day the federal prosecutor presented the digital evidence, the recording from the coffee shop, the screenshots of Derek coordinating the transfer of proprietary client data, the wire records showing money moved into accounts under his direct control. I sat 3 rows back, in a plain gray blazer, and watched a man I had once promised to spend my life with sit very still at the defense table while his own voice, "Don't worry about Eleanor. She's too stupid to see it," played through the courtroom's speakers for a jury of 12 strangers to judge. He didn't look at me once during the entire proceeding. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't need him to. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. Derek was convicted on charges of corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets, and wire fraud. At sentencing 3 weeks later, the judge, a stern, silver-haired woman named Judge Alvarez, who had clearly read every page of the evidentiary record with real attention, handed down 7 years in federal prison, along with a restitution order requiring Derek to repay, to the extent he was ever able, his share of the losses attributable directly to his own actions, a figure that, combined with legal fees, would likely follow him for the rest of his working life. Before the sentence was read, Derek was given the opportunity to address the court. He stood, his suit noticeably looser than it had been 10 months earlier, and delivered a halting statement about regret and lost opportunity that struck me, even then, as more concerned with his own narrative than with any real accounting of what he'd done. He did not mention me by name. He did not mention the thousands of Marsh Dynamics employees whose jobs had been put at risk by his and his family's greed. He talked mostly about how much he had lost. I left the courthouse that afternoon without speaking to any reporters gathered outside, walked 3 blocks in the spring sunshine to a small park along the river, and sat on a bench for nearly 20 minutes without checking my phone once. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel avenged. Exactly in the way I might have expected to feel a year earlier, sitting in a parked car outside that same courthouse with a fresh decree in my lap. What I felt, mostly, was finished. The specific quiet relief of closing a book you'd been afraid, for a long time, that you might never reach the end of. Diane's civil trial concluded a few months later with a judgment against her for just over $3 million, an amount she would almost certainly never be able to fully repay, given that most of what she'd stolen had already been seized as part of the criminal restitution owed by her siblings. She sold the modest condo she'd moved into after her divorce from Walter finalized, and according to a distant cousin who occasionally still called our HR department fishing for information, she now worked part-time at a discount retail store outside Rockford, not far from the flea market where she'd started out decades earlier, back before she ever imagined the distance she might travel, and the distance she would eventually be forced to travel back. There was one loose thread from that whole ordeal that I couldn't let go of, no matter how many months passed. Ethan and Lily, Neil's children, caught up in a scheme that was never theirs, made to kneel on hot pavement by a grandmother who should have protected them instead of using them. I thought about that 10-year-old boy snapping the string of a cardboard sign and walking his little sister away down the sidewalk more often than I probably should have, given how many other things demanded my attention that year. I asked Daniel, quietly, off the record, whether there was any way to find out how the two of them were doing without it looking like I was trying to insert myself into a family that had every reason to want nothing more to do with the Marsh name. He came back a week later with a modest, careful answer. Their mother, Neil's ex-wife Rachel, had full custody, had never been implicated in any of the fraud, and was, according to public court records related to Neil's restitution case, struggling financially now that both her ex-husband's income and the family's collective largesse had evaporated overnight. I didn't call Rachel myself. I asked Daniel to reach out through her attorney instead, carefully, with an offer that had no strings attached and no request for public acknowledgement. A fully funded educational trust for both children, covering private schooling through college, administered by an independent trustee with no connection to Marsh Dynamics or to me personally, structured so that neither Rachel nor the children would ever need to interact with anyone from my life to access it. I asked, specifically, that my name never be attached to it in any paperwork the children might one day see. Rachel's attorney called back within a few days, cautious and clearly suspicious of the offer's origins, until Daniel explained, patiently, that this had nothing to do with Neil's crimes and everything to do with two children who had been dragged into an adult scheme they had no part in creating. Rachel accepted, on the condition that she could write me a letter. Not for publicity, just so I would know she'd received it and understood what it meant. The letter arrived 2 months later, handwritten, a little uneven in places where I suspect she'd rewritten it more than once. She thanked me, said Ethan still talked, quietly, about that day at the estate, that he'd told her afterward in the car, that he'd been scared standing up to his grandmother, but that it had felt like the only thing that made sense to do. She said Lily had nightmares for a few weeks afterward but was doing better now, that both kids had started at a new school in the fall, a fresh start away from anyone who might recognize their last name. I kept that letter in the top drawer of my desk for a long time afterward. It didn't undo anything Diane had done to those children. It didn't erase the image of two kids kneeling on scorching pavement with cardboard signs around their necks. But it felt, in some small and necessary way, like proof that not everything touched by that family's greed had to end up broken. Some things, if you were careful and patient and quiet about it, could still be protected. Marsh Dynamics turned 35 years old that following June, and my father, despite his growing comfort with a slower schedule, insisted on throwing a proper anniversary gala at the Peninsula downtown, the kind of event with a string quartet and a seated dinner for 400 people that he had always loved, and that I, historically, had found slightly exhausting to sit through as the dutiful daughter smiling in the background. This year was different. This year I stood at the podium myself, in a dark green gown my mother would have approved of, looking out over a room full of employees, longtime partners, board members, and a scattering of local business reporters, including Renata Ford, who caught my eye from a table near the back and gave me a small, knowing nod. 35 years ago, I began, my father leased a single warehouse on the south side of this city with 3 employees and a line of credit most banks considered a bad bet. He built something out of almost nothing because he refused to let other people's doubts decide what he was capable of. I spent a good part of the last 5 years forgetting that lesson, letting people who had done nothing to earn my trust convince me that loyalty meant silence and that love meant looking away from things I should have confronted directly. I paused, aware of exactly how many people in that room had watched the last year of my life unfold in newspaper columns and hallway gossip, and decided, deliberately, not to soften what came next. I won't stand up here and pretend the last year was anything other than painful. It was. But it also taught me the actual difference between the people who wanted to be near this company because they believed in what we build here, and the people who simply wanted access to what we'd already built. I'm grateful, more than I can easily put into words, to everyone in this room who chose to stay through a very messy period of transition, who kept doing good, honest work while the people around them were busy trying to explain away theft as ambition. This company is 35 years old today because of you, not despite the mess certain people tried to bury you under. I raised a glass, and 400 people raised theirs with me, and for a moment, standing at that podium with my father watching from the front table, his eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen since before my mother died, I felt something settle fully into place. Not vindication, not even pride exactly, but something quieter and sturdier. The sense of standing, finally, entirely on ground, that was mine. After the speeches, Thomas Kwan found me near the bar and told me, in the careful, understated way he said most things, that morale across the company had measurably improved over the past 2 quarters according to the internal engagement surveys HR ran twice a year. The first genuine increase, he mentioned, in nearly 4 years. I hadn't asked for that statistic. It meant more to me than almost anything else said to me that whole evening. It was late that same summer when my father had what his doctor later described, with careful understatement, as a cardiac event. Not severe enough to require surgery, but serious enough that he spent 4 days in Northwestern Memorial, hooked up to monitors that beeped through the night while I sat in a vinyl armchair beside his bed, unable to bring myself to go home even after the nurses assured me, repeatedly, that he was stable. He woke on the second night to find me still there, my suit jacket draped over the back of the chair, a stack of contracts I hadn't touched balanced on my knees. "You should go home, Eleanor," he said, his voice thin but still carrying that same dry note of authority. "I'm not going anywhere tonight." "I know," I said. "I'm staying anyway." He was quiet for a while, watching the slow green line of his heart monitor trace its steady rhythm across the screen. "I used to worry, you know," he said eventually, "that I'd raised you to need my approval too much. That I'd made it too easy for you to mistake obedience for love, the way you did with Derek, kneeling on my study floor at 26. Certain that crying hard enough would make something true that wasn't. You didn't make me do that," I said. "That was mine." "Maybe," he allowed. "But watching you take this company back, watching you handle Diane and her whole rotten family without losing yourself in bitterness the way I might have at your age, I stopped worrying about that particular fear a long time ago. I just never told you, because I didn't want you to think I was only proud of you now that you'd proven something to me. You didn't owe me proof, Eleanor. I should have said that a long time ago." I reached over and took his hand, the skin thin and spotted with age, but the grip still strong. Still the same hand that had walked me down an aisle he'd had serious doubts about. Still the same hand that had signed off on a marriage he must have known, on some level, was a mistake, because he loved me too much to be the one who told me no. "You never owed me a company either," I told him. "I used to think I had something to prove to earn my place in it. I don't think that anymore. I think I just want to build something good with the time I have, the same way you did." He squeezed my hand and closed his eyes, and for the rest of that quiet, beeping night, we didn't say anything else. We didn't need to. He was discharged 4 days later with a stern list of dietary restrictions he complained about for exactly 1 week before quietly following almost all of them, and a standing order from his cardiologist to reduce his hours at the office to something closer to genuine part-time. He didn't fight the transition the way I expected him to. If anything, he seemed almost relieved to finally, fully, hand over the daily weight of running Marsh Dynamics to someone he trusted completely. Someone who, as it turned out, had needed to survive a small private catastrophe of her own before she was ready to carry it. Almost exactly a year to the day after I had stood on the courthouse steps holding a decree that felt like the end of everything, I drove my father out to Rose Hill Cemetery on the north side of the city, taking the old silver Volvo my mother used to drive to the grocery store, the one my father had never been able to bring himself to sell even after 14 years. The morning was crisp for late September, the kind of cool, clear light that makes the whole city look freshly washed, and the drive wound past rows of maple trees just beginning to turn at the edges. It had been a long time since my father and I had shared a car ride in that kind of easy, unforced quiet. He wore a simple gray button-down, his face lined with the accumulated weight of 72 years, but his eyes, that morning, were bright and unusually soft. We parked near the older section of the cemetery and walked slowly together up a gently sloping path lined with old oaks, carrying a small bouquet of white peonies, my mother's favorite, the same flower she'd carried at her own wedding, according to the photograph that still sat on my father's nightstand. Her grave sat beneath the shade of one of the oldest trees in that section, the headstone reading simply, "Helen Marsh, beloved wife and mother," the granite still clean and well kept. Thanks to a groundskeeper my father paid privately to visit twice a month regardless of the season. He knelt, with some visible effort, and used a handkerchief from his breast pocket to clear a few fallen leaves from the base of the stone, his hands trembling slightly but moving with a tenderness that 13 years of grief had never worn down. I placed the peonies against the stone and lit a small votive candle we'd brought, watching the thin curl of smoke rise into the clear morning air, carrying with it, it felt like, some of the weight of the last year. "Mom," I said quietly, "your daughter finally came to see you with good news for once. The company's safe. I found myself again. I think you'd be proud of how it turned out, even if it took me longer than it should have to get here." Warm tears slid down my cheeks, but they weren't the tears of a woman being crushed by grief. They were something closer to relief. The specific, hard-won relief of someone who has finally set down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten what her own shoulders felt like without it. My father stood beside me, resting a hand gently on my shoulder, his voice quiet in the stillness of the cemetery. "Eleanor, did you ever resent me for knowing, deep down, that Derek's family wasn't what they pretended to be, and letting you marry him anyway? For letting you struggle through 5 years of that marriage on your own without stepping in sooner?" I turned to look at him and shook my head firmly, wrapping my arms around his thin frame. "No, Dad, I don't resent you for any of it. Because of your patience, because you let me find my own way to the truth instead of forcing it on me. I understand people now in a way I never would have otherwise. I understand exactly what blind love actually costs a person, and I understand it in my bones now, not just in theory." "If you had stepped in too early," I continued, "or fought me on it the way some part of you clearly wanted to, I think I would have spent my whole life resenting you for it instead of learning anything real. I never would have built the strength it took to walk into that boardroom and take this company back with my own hands. I needed to fall, Dad. I needed it to be my fall, not one you cushioned for me." My father smiled, the gentle, weathered smile of a man who had spent the better part of his final years quietly forging, out of his own restraint and his own private grief, a lesson written for his daughter in something far more permanent than words. "An eagle that wants to fly has to break its own shell eventually," he said. Nobody can do that part for you, no matter how much they love you. A person only really grows up the moment they pick themselves back up from the fall that actually hurt. From here on out, the past stays closed, Eleanor. The road ahead is entirely yours. Walk it with your head up, and don't waste another minute being afraid of it. The wind moved gently through the oak trees above us, rustling the leaves in a way that felt, in that quiet cemetery, almost like an answer carried down from somewhere far away. The comforting reach of a mother who had never really left, extending itself, even now, toward the husband and daughter she'd left behind. We stood there together for a long while after that, not speaking, just watching the candle burn down slowly in the cool morning air, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something in my chest that wasn't grief, wasn't anger, wasn't even relief exactly. It was something quieter and more permanent than any of those. It was peace. About 8 months into Derek's sentence, a letter arrived at my office forwarded through Daniel's firm, since Derek had no legal way of contacting me directly given the terms of the restraining order I'd filed after the break-in at headquarters. Daniel read it first, as he did with anything connected to the case, before deciding it contained nothing threatening enough to withhold from me, and passed it along with a raised eyebrow and no further comment. It was 3 handwritten pages, the handwriting noticeably different from the confident, looping signature I remembered from our marriage certificate. Smaller, more careful, the handwriting of a man with a great deal of time and very little to fill it with besides his own thoughts. He wrote about the routine of federal prison, the strange, flattening sameness of every day, the fact that he'd started reading again for the first time since college, working through a stack of paperbacks from the prison library that he said had given him more time to think honestly about himself than he'd allowed himself in over a decade. He didn't ask me for anything this time. That, more than anything else in the letter, was what convinced me it might actually be sincere rather than another performance. He wrote that he understood now, in a way he hadn't allowed himself to understand at the coffee shop or in the courtroom, that he had built his entire adult identity around taking things that weren't his to take. My trust, my family's company, eventually even Paige's affections, which he now recognized had been just as transactional on her side as his had been on his. He said he didn't expect forgiveness and wasn't asking for it, only that he wanted me to know, for whatever it was worth from someone in his position, that he understood exactly how much damage he'd done, and that no version of prison time would ever fully repay it. He mentioned, near the end, that he thought about the 2 children, Ethan and Lily, more than almost anything else. That watching, secondhand through his mother's frantic phone calls before her own trial, the footage of his nephew snapping that cardboard sign in half had been the moment something in him had actually broken open, rather than just cracked under legal pressure. He said he hoped, if I ever had any way of knowing, that they were doing all right. I sat with that letter for a long time before deciding how to respond, if I would respond at all. In the end, I wrote him 4 sentences, no more. I told him that the children were doing well, without offering any further detail about the trust or Rachel's letter, because that information belonged to them, not to him. I told him that reading was a good use of his time, and that I hoped he continued it. I told him I had no interest in corresponding further, not out of anger, but because I had built a life in the last year that didn't require his presence in it, even at the margins, even in the form of an occasional letter. And I told him, finally, that I hoped he used whatever years he had left to become a person capable of actual honesty, because the version of him I'd married had never once, in 5 years, managed it. I mailed the letter myself, on my lunch break, dropping it into a blue mailbox on the corner near my office, rather than routing it through Daniel's firm, A small, private gesture that felt like closing a door quietly rather than slamming it. I never heard from him again after that, and I never went looking for a reason to. That second winter, I started something I hadn't planned as any kind of grand gesture, a mentorship program inside Marsh Dynamics, specifically aimed at young women in our finance and operations divisions, the departments that had been hit hardest and most personally by the fraud, the ones where I imagined a certain kind of quiet, corrosive cynicism might have taken root after watching senior leadership turn out to be thieves. I met with a small group every other Thursday over lunch in a conference room on the 37th floor. No agenda beyond honest conversation about the actual, unglamorous realities of building a career in a business run by a family whose last public scandal had made the front page of the business section. One of the young women in that group, a sharp 24-year-old financial analyst named Priya Anand, asked me once, with the kind of directness only someone that early in her career still has the nerve for, whether I regretted marrying Derek at all, given everything it had cost me. I thought about the question seriously before answering, because I owed her something more honest than a rehearsed line. There are days I regret the specific 5 years, I told her. The sleepless nights, the humiliation of finding out in front of a courthouse full of strangers exactly how thoroughly I'd been used. I won't pretend those years didn't cost me something real. But I don't regret who I became on the other side of it. I don't think I would have become the kind of leader capable of doing what I did in that boardroom if I hadn't first spent 5 years learning, the hard way, exactly what it looks like when someone is lying to you with a smile on their face. That's not a lesson I'd wish on anyone. But it's one I'm grateful, in a complicated way, to have actually learned, rather than just been warned about. Priya nodded slowly, turning that over. My mom always told me love makes you stupid, she said. I never really believed her until I watched this whole thing play out on the news. Your mom's not entirely wrong, I said. But I'd put it a little differently. Love doesn't make you stupid. Refusing to look honestly at evidence because you're afraid of what it means, that's what makes you stupid. And love is just the excuse people use to justify doing it. The actual antidote isn't refusing to love people. It's refusing to stop paying attention just because loving someone makes it more comfortable not to. That line, apparently, made its way around the office in the months that followed, repeated informally in performance reviews and onboarding sessions until it eventually appeared, slightly reworded, in the company's updated Code of Conduct training under a section about conflicts of interest. A strange, quiet legacy for a sentence I'd said off the cuff, to a room of 6 young women eating sandwiches on a Thursday afternoon, but one I found, honestly, more meaningful than almost any of the formal recognition I received that year. It was nearly 2 years after the divorce, in early spring, when I met Nathan Cole. He wasn't part of my world in any of the ways Derek had been. No connection to Marsh Dynamics, no ambition toward it either. He ran a small structural engineering firm that Marsh Dynamics had contracted to assess the aging infrastructure of one of our older manufacturing facilities downstate. And I met him not at a gala or a fundraiser, but on a Tuesday afternoon in a hard hat and steel-toed boots, walking the floor of a facility that smelled like machine oil and hadn't been renovated since the Clinton administration. He was direct in a way I found, at first, almost disarming after years of being surrounded by people who measured every word for its strategic value before saying it. He told me, 20 minutes into our first meeting, that half the load-bearing recommendations in the previous engineering report had been generated by an inexperienced junior associate trying to pad billable hours, and that he wasn't going to sign off on anything he didn't personally believe was necessary, even if it meant a smaller invoice for his own firm. I liked him instantly, and distrusted my own instinct to like him just as quickly. A hangover, I suspected, from 2 years of learning not to trust first impressions of charming men. We didn't start dating for another 4 months, and even then, slowly, dinner every few weeks, long walks along the river on weekends when both our schedules allowed it, conversations that ranged from municipal zoning law, which he found genuinely fascinating in a way that made me laugh more than once, to the particular grief of losing a parent young, since his own father had died when Nathan was in college. He never once, in all those months, asked me a single question about Derek, about the trial, about any of it, until I brought it up myself over dinner on a night I'd had 1 glass of wine too many and found myself, unexpectedly, wanting to talk about it. I looked it up, obviously, he admitted, when I asked whether he already knew the broad outlines of my history before we met. It's not exactly hard to find. I just figured it wasn't my business to bring up until you decided it was yours to share. That restraint, more than any grand romantic gesture he could have offered instead, was what finally let something in me relax that had been braced, quietly, for over 2 years. He wasn't performing patience for my benefit. He genuinely didn't need anything from me that I wasn't already offering freely, which was, I was slowly coming to understand, the entire difference between the kind of love that costs you everything and the kind that simply adds something good to a life you'd already built to stand on its own. I introduced him to my father on a Sunday afternoon that June, over the kind of low-key backyard lunch my father preferred now to any formal dinner. My father watched Nathan for most of the afternoon with the quiet, assessing patience of a man who had learned, the hard way, exactly what it cost his family the last time he'd extended trust too easily. At the end of the visit, walking Nathan to his car, my father shook his hand and said only, "You're welcome back any time," which, from him, was as close to a blessing as I imagine he was ever going to give anyone again. I wasn't in a hurry that time. I had learned, finally, the difference between urgency and love, and I intended to take my time proving to myself that I understood the difference before I let anyone new get close enough to test it. My father formally retired as chairman of Marsh Dynamics 18 months after his cardiac scare, exactly on the timeline he'd promised the board when he first appointed me co-CEO. He didn't want a large public event. He'd never much liked being the center of attention, despite 4 decades spent running a company that made that nearly unavoidable. But the board insisted on something, and eventually we settled on a modest reception in the 40th floor boardroom itself, the same room where I had once slammed 3 binders of evidence down on the glass table in front of Diane Callahan and watched her entire world start to collapse. It felt fitting somehow that this transition would happen in the same space. My father stood at the head of that table one final time as chairman, surrounded by roughly 30 people, board members, senior executives, Thomas Kwan, Gary Fenn, Daniel Reyes, and a handful of longtime employees who had been with the company since its earliest years in that original leased warehouse. He spoke for maybe 10 minutes, most of it dry, understated humor about the mistakes he'd made building this company from nothing. The vendors who'd once tried to swindle him in the early 90s, the year he'd nearly lost everything to a bad expansion decision in 1997 that only a stubborn refusal to quit had pulled the company back from. Near the end, his voice shifted, quieter and more deliberate, and I felt the whole room lean in slightly, sensing what was coming. "I built this company because I refused to let anyone else decide what I was capable of," he said, echoing, almost word for word, what he'd said the day he announced my co-CEO appointment. But a company built by one stubborn man only survives as long as that man does, unless he's smart enough to find someone who can carry it further than he ever could alone. I've watched my daughter take a version of this company that had been quietly hollowed out by people who mistook proximity to wealth for a right to it, and rebuild it into something stronger than it was before any of that happened. I'm not handing this company to Eleanor today because she's my daughter. I'm handing it to her because she has already, over the last 2 years, proven every single day that she's the right person to hold it. He signed the final transfer documents at that table, his handwriting steadier than it had been in his hospital bed 18 months earlier, and handed me a small, worn leather folio that I recognized immediately. The original lease agreement for that first warehouse on the south side, dated 37 years earlier. The ink faded but still legible, the address of a building that, I happen to know, was still standing. Now converted into loft apartments a few blocks from a coffee shop I'd once sat in across from a man reading his own downfall off a digital recorder. "Keep this somewhere you'll actually see it," he told me, pressing the folio into my hands. "Not locked in a vault. Somewhere on your actual desk. So you remember, every single day, exactly how little this all started as, and exactly how much of it you're responsible for now." I kept it on the corner of my desk from that day forward, next to a small framed photograph of my mother that had, for 5 years, lived in a box in a closet at the mansion I no longer owned, and that I had retrieved, quietly, the week after the divorce finalized, and never put away again. 2 years to the day after I stood on the steps of the Cook County Courthouse holding a decree that felt weightless in my hand, I found myself back there, though not for any reason connected to my own life this time. Priya, the young analyst from my mentorship group, had asked me, a little nervously, whether I would come sit with her the morning her own divorce finalized. Her marriage, mercifully, hadn't involved anything close to what mine had. Just a slow, ordinary, drifting apart from a college boyfriend she'd married too young and outgrown gently rather than violently. But she said she didn't want to walk out of that building alone, and she'd heard, somewhere along the office grapevine, that I understood something about what that walk felt like. I met her on the same steps at 9 that morning, the August heat already pressing down even at that hour, and we sat together on a stone bench near the entrance while she waited for her attorney. She was quiet for a while, watching people move up and down the courthouse steps, before she asked me, carefully, whether it got easier. "The morning of, no," I told her honestly. "The morning of is always going to feel like the floor dropping out from under you, even when the marriage wasn't a good one, even when you know, rationally, that this is the right outcome. Grief doesn't care whether the thing you're grieving was good for you. It just cares that it's over." "But a year from now?" she asked. 2 years? I thought about the version of myself who had sat in a parked Range Rover on this same street 2 years earlier, sobbing into a steering wheel, deleting 5,000 photographs with shaking hands. I thought about the mansion I'd sold, the condo I'd built slowly into something entirely mine, the boardroom where I'd taken back a company that had nearly been stolen out from under my family, the letter from Rachel thanking me for something I'd never wanted acknowledged, the quiet, unhurried way Nathan had waited months before asking me a single question about any of it. "A year from now, it'll feel like a chapter you survived," I told her. 2 years from now, if you let yourself actually do the work of rebuilding rather than just waiting for the pain to fade on its own, it starts to feel like the beginning of something instead of the end of it. I'm not going to tell you it happens automatically. It doesn't. You have to actually decide, some mornings when you really don't want to, that you're going to build something better than what you lost, instead of just waiting around for the hole it left behind to fill itself in. Priya's attorney came to collect her a few minutes later, and I watched her walk into that courthouse with her shoulders a little straighter than they'd been when I first sat down beside her. I didn't go in with her. This wasn't my story to be present for. Just my job to make sure she didn't have to face the parking lot alone afterward. And I sat on that same bench for a while longer after she disappeared inside, thinking about how strange it was that a building which had once represented to me the single worst morning of my adult life had slowly, over 2 years, come to represent something closer to a hinge point. Not the end of anything, just the place where one version of a life stopped and, if you were willing to do the work, a sturdier one began. Priya came out 40 minutes later, decree in hand, dry-eyed but visibly shaken, and I bought her a coffee at the same downtown shop, 2 blocks away, where I had once watched Derek's face go bone white listening to a recording of his own voice describing exactly how stupid he thought I was. I didn't tell her that particular detail. Some scars are useful to show people as proof that healing is possible. Others are just yours to carry quietly, evidence of a war nobody else needs the full map of. Nathan and I had been together just under 2 years by the time he asked me, on an ordinary Tuesday evening rather than any occasion designed for maximum romantic effect, whether I'd consider moving in together. We were standing in his kitchen, him halfway through making pasta, me setting the table with plates that didn't match because neither of us had ever bothered replacing the mismatched set he'd inherited from a college roommate, and he asked it so casually, stirring a pot of sauce, that it took me a moment to register the actual weight of the question underneath the offhand delivery. "I'm not proposing," he clarified quickly, catching my expression. "I know you well enough by now to know that would probably send you running for the door. I'm just saying I like waking up in the same apartment as you more mornings than not, and I'd rather build toward that on purpose than keep pretending it's an accident that I've got a drawer at your place and you've got one here." I laughed, more from relief than humor, because he was right. A grand gesture, a ring, a scene designed for an audience, all of it would have made something in me recoil instinctively, the same protective reflex that had kept me cautious through 2 years of dating him. But this, an honest, unglamorous question asked over a pot of marinara on a Tuesday, felt like exactly the kind of offer I could actually trust. "I need you to understand something first," I told him, setting down the plates and looking at him directly, because I owed him this much honesty before I said yes to anything. I spent 5 years building an entire identity around being someone's wife, and I lost most of myself doing it. If we do this, I need it to be 2 whole people building something together, not one person disappearing into the other one's life. I need my name on the lease. I need my own money staying my own money, not because I don't trust you, but because I never again want to be in a position where I don't know exactly what's mine if something goes wrong. Nathan set down the wooden spoon and turned to face me fully. "Eleanor, I've watched you rebuild an entire company from a boardroom takeover in under a week. I'm not remotely worried about you disappearing into anything. If anything, I've been quietly terrified this whole time that you'd eventually realize you don't actually need me for anything and lose interest." He said it lightly, but there was something genuine underneath it, an actual vulnerability he rarely let show. "That's exactly the point," I told him, softening. "I don't need you, Nathan. Not the way I thought I needed Derek, where losing him would have meant losing my whole sense of who I was. I want you. That's a completely different thing, and it took me a 5-year marriage falling apart to actually understand the difference." We moved into a larger place together that autumn, a converted loft with exposed brick in the West Loop, close enough to both our offices that neither of us had to sacrifice much of anything to make the arrangement work. I kept my name on half of everything, exactly as I'd asked. He never once brought it up as an insult to his trustworthiness, understanding in that quiet, unhurried way of his that it wasn't about him at all. It was about a version of myself I had promised, standing in a parked car outside a courthouse 2 years earlier, that I would never again let disappear that completely into someone else's life. 3 years after the morning I stood on the courthouse steps with a divorce decree in my hand, Marsh Dynamics posted its strongest annual earnings in company history. driven in no small part by the operational discipline I'd instituted in the wake of the fraud, tighter procurement oversight, a genuinely independent audit committee, a hiring process that no longer bent around family connections. My father, fully retired now, spent most of his days working through crossword puzzles on the back porch of the house I'd grown up in, occasionally still calling me with unsolicited advice about a supplier contract or a market trend he'd read about in the morning paper. Advice I mostly still took, because 40 years of running a company from nothing had earned him that. I thought sometimes about the woman who had sat in that parked Range Rover outside the courthouse, deleting 5,000 photographs with trembling hands, certain that the worst thing that could ever happen to her had just happened. I understood now, from the distance of 3 years, that she had actually been standing at the beginning of the best decision of her life, even though it had arrived disguised as the worst morning of it. I thought about Diane, too, occasionally, without much bitterness left in the thought. A woman who had spent decades scraping her way up from a flea market folding table, only to build on top of that hard-won foundation an entire architecture of theft that eventually collapsed under its own weight and buried her back almost exactly where she'd started, working a part-time retail job outside Rockford, estranged from a husband who'd fled the moment things got difficult, and a son doing 7 years in federal prison for crimes she had, in her own way, taught him to believe were simply the natural order of how the world worked. I didn't wish her further harm. I also didn't spend any energy wishing her well. She had built her own ending, brick by embezzled brick, long before I ever walked into that boardroom. I thought, most of all, about Ethan, who would be a teenager by now, and I hoped, in the quiet, private way you hope for people whose lives you've only glancingly touched, that the trust fund sitting untouched under an independent trustee's care was giving him and his sister something his grandmother never managed to offer either of them. An actual future built on something other than someone else's stolen money. Marsh Dynamics still occupied the same 40th floor boardroom where I had once slammed 3 binders of evidence onto a glass table and watched an entire family's carefully constructed lie collapse in real time. I sat at the head of that table now most weeks, running meetings my father used to run, making decisions he trusted me to make without needing his approval first, carrying forward a company that had nearly been hollowed out by people who mistook access for ownership, and had instead been handed, intact and stronger than before, to the one person in that whole saga who had actually earned her place in it the hard way. Maggie and I still had dinner most months, the same red-checkered tablecloth restaurant in Logan Square, though her twin boys were old enough now to occasionally join us, arguing loudly over who got the last breadstick while she rolled her eyes with the specific exhausted fondness of a mother who wouldn't trade the chaos for anything quieter. On one of those evenings, not long after the earnings call that confirmed Marsh Dynamics' strongest year in company history, she asked me the question I suspect she'd been holding on to for a while, the way she used to hold back honest observations about Derek until she judged the timing right. "Do you ever think about how different this all would have looked?" she asked, twisting her wine glass the way she always did before saying something she'd clearly rehearsed. "If your dad had just said no back when you were 26? If he'd put his foot down instead of signing off on the whole thing?" I'd thought about that question more than a few times over the preceding 3 years, usually late at night, usually when I couldn't sleep. I used to think about it as the tragedy of the whole story, I told her. That he could have spared me 5 years of misery with one firm conversation. But I don't actually believe that anymore. If he'd forced the issue, I would have married Derek anyway, just angrier at my father for trying to stop me. And I'd have gone into that marriage without a single person left in my corner willing to tell me the truth once things started going wrong. The only reason I called him, sobbing, from that parking lot outside the courthouse, was because he'd never once used the words, "I told you so" against me. If he'd fought me on it originally, I'm not sure I'd have had anywhere safe left to land when it finally fell apart. "That's a very generous read of 5 wasted years," Maggie said, not unkindly. "They weren't wasted," I said, and found, saying it out loud, that I actually believed it fully for the first time. "They were expensive. There's a difference. I paid an enormous amount for what I learned in that marriage. About people, about my own blind spots, about the specific kind of quiet complicity it takes to let people take advantage of you for years without noticing. But I did learn it, and I don't think I'd have become someone capable of walking into that boardroom and taking my family's company back if I hadn't first spent 5 years learning exactly what it costs to look away from something you already suspect is true." Maggie reached across the table and squeezed my hand, the same gesture she'd offered the very first dinner we'd had after the divorce finalized, 3 years earlier, when neither of us had any idea yet how the rest of the story would unfold. "For what it's worth," she said, "I like this version of you a lot better than the one I used to have dinner with when you were still married to him. You laugh more now. You used to check your phone every 4 minutes at dinner, like you were bracing for bad news. You don't do that anymore." I hadn't noticed the change in myself as it happened, the way you rarely notice healing while you're actually in the middle of it. You only see it afterward in the accumulated evidence of small things: a phone that stayed in your bag through an entire dinner, a laugh that came without checking first whether it was safe to have one, a life built slowly, deliberately, entirely on your own terms, standing on ground solid enough that you'd finally stopped waiting for it to give way beneath you. The last thing I want to tell you about happened almost 4 years to the week after that first morning on the courthouse steps, and it felt, when it happened, like the actual final period at the end of a very long sentence. Marsh Dynamics was hosting its annual shareholders meeting, held that year in a renovated event space inside the same Southside warehouse district where my father had leased his very first building 39 years earlier, a deliberate choice on my part, meant as a quiet tribute rather than a grand gesture, though the local business press noticed it anyway and ran a small feature on the symbolism. I stood at the podium in front of roughly 200 shareholders, board members, and employees, delivering the kind of routine annual report that, 4 years earlier, I would never have imagined myself capable of delivering with a steady voice. Partway through the question and answer session that followed, an older shareholder I didn't recognize, a soft-spoken man in his 70s who identified himself only as a retired schoolteacher who'd invested a modest inheritance in Marsh Dynamics stock decades earlier, raised his hand and asked a question that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings. "Ms. Marsh," he said, "I read about everything that happened here a few years back. The family, the fraud, all of it. I've followed a lot of companies through scandals like that over the years, and most of them never really recover the trust they lose. This one clearly did. I suppose I just wanted to ask, in your own words, what you think actually made the difference." I hadn't prepared an answer to that particular question, and I found myself taking a moment before responding, genuinely turning it over rather than reaching for a rehearsed line. "I think most companies that don't recover from something like this," I said finally, "try to manage the story instead of actually fixing what was broken. They hire a communications firm, they issue a careful statement, they quietly settle everything behind closed doors, and they hope the public's attention moves on to the next scandal before anyone notices nothing structural actually changed. We didn't do that. We opened everything up. The bank statements, the shell corporations, the actual dollar figures, in our own lobby, in front of our own employees, because I decided early on that the only way to actually earn trust back was to refuse to hide from exactly how badly it had been broken in the first place. And then, once the truth was fully out in the open, we did the unglamorous work of actually fixing the systems that let it happen. Better oversight, real independence in our audit process, a hiring culture that doesn't bend around who someone happens to be related to. I think people can tell the difference eventually between a company that's managing a crisis and a company that's actually changed because of one. We tried very hard to be the second kind. The old man nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied, and thanked me, and the meeting moved on to less dramatic matters: supply chain logistics, a proposed expansion into 2 new states, the usual unglamorous machinery of running a large company. But I thought about his question for the rest of that day, and for a while afterward, because it crystallized something I hadn't fully articulated to myself before, even after 4 years of living through the aftermath. The difference, I had come to believe, between a life that survives a catastrophic betrayal and one that simply endures it in quiet, permanent damage, comes down almost entirely to whether you're willing to look directly at exactly how bad the damage actually was, rather than managing the story of it for other people's comfort, or even for your own. Eleanor Marsh of 4 years earlier had spent 5 years managing the story of her marriage, smoothing over Derek's absences, explaining away his mother's schemes, telling herself and everyone around her that things were fine right up until the moment a judge's stamp made it impossible to pretend any longer. The version of me standing at that podium had learned, the hard way, that the only path back to something stronger than what you lost runs directly through the wreckage, not around it. That evening, walking home along the river with Nathan, the lights of the city scattered across the water the way they'd been scattered the night. Years earlier, when I'd walked home from dinner with Maggie turning over the same question about what actually made anything survivable, I found myself telling him about the old shareholders' question, and about the answer I'd given without quite planning to give it. "You know," Nathan said, threading his fingers through mine as we walked, "I think that's probably true of most things that break badly. Bridges, marriages, companies, people. You can patch over a crack quickly and hope nobody looks too closely, or you can actually dig down to whatever structural flaw let the crack form in the first place, and fix that instead, even though it takes longer and it's a lot less comfortable while you're doing it." "That's a very engineer way of putting it," I told him, laughing. "I am, in fact, an engineer," he said. "It's mostly all I've got." It was, as it turned out, exactly enough. Dear reader, Eleanor's story ends here, though of course her life kept going long after the last page of this particular chapter closed. I wanted to sit with you for just a few more minutes before we part ways, because a story like this one is never really just about one woman, one marriage, one family's greed unraveling in a Chicago boardroom. It's about something a lot of us recognize on some private, uncomfortable level, whether or not we've ever lived through anything quite this dramatic ourselves. There is a particular kind of love that convinces us silence is the same thing as loyalty. We see something wrong. A spouse who's a little too smooth, a mother-in-law who's a little too eager, relatives appearing in positions they didn't earn, and instead of looking directly at it, we build elaborate, exhausting justifications for why it's fine, why we're imagining things, why the people who love us wouldn't do that to us. Eleanor spent 5 years constructing exactly that kind of architecture around her own life, brick by brick, because the alternative, admitting she'd been deceived by people she'd chosen to trust completely, was, for a long time, more painful than the deception itself. And there is a particular kind of parental love, embodied here by Charles Marsh, that looks, from the outside, almost like negligence. A father who watches his daughter walk toward a mistake he can see coming from a mile away, and instead of blocking the road, simply stands nearby, quietly gathering the evidence he suspects she'll eventually need, waiting for the moment she's ready to ask for it herself, rather than forcing it on her before she can hear it. That kind of restraint is not indifference. It is one of the hardest, most disciplined forms of love there is. The willingness to let someone you love fall, because you understand, better than they do in the moment, that catching them too soon will only teach them that falling is something other people are responsible for preventing. If you take nothing else from Eleanor's story, I hope you take this. The people who truly love you are rarely the ones performing devotion the loudest. Derek cried on command. Diane called Eleanor a blessing to her face while quietly siphoning millions from the company that fed her family. Performed love is cheap, and it is almost always trying to sell you something. Real love, more often, looks like a father who says almost nothing for 3 years, waiting patiently for his daughter to find her own way home, and then simply opens the door without a single word of blame when she finally does. There is also, in this story, a harder truth about money and about what it actually means to earn something. Every dollar the Callahan family stole from Marsh Dynamics eventually cost them everything they'd built their identities around. Roy and Sandra and Neil facing years of restitution payments that will likely follow them for the rest of their working lives. Diane scraping by in a part-time retail job not far from the flea market she started at decades earlier. Derek spending 7 years of his life in a federal prison cell, reading paperbacks and writing letters nobody was obligated to answer. Wealth acquired through scheming and theft has a way of evaporating exactly when you need it most, leaving behind nothing but the specific, hollow humiliation of having built your entire self-image around something that was never actually yours. Only the money you've earned honestly, only the love you've given without expecting a return on it, follows you all the way to the end of your life and actually stays. And finally, there is the matter of the children. Ethan and Lily, dragged into an adult scheme they had no part in creating, made to kneel on burning pavement by a grandmother who should have shielded them instead of using them. If this story leaves you with any single practical lesson to carry forward, let it be this one. Whatever grievances the adults in a family are working through, however justified the anger, however desperate the circumstances, children are never an acceptable instrument for settling them. Ethan's small, furious act of snapping that cardboard sign in half remains, for me, the single most important moment in this entire story. A 10-year-old boy who understood something his own grandmother had apparently never learned, that dignity is not something you're allowed to spend on someone else's behalf. And that real accountability means the person who did wrong is the one who has to answer for it, not the smallest and most powerless people standing nearby. Eleanor rebuilt her life slowly, deliberately, refusing to let either bitterness or a rushed search for a replacement relationship define the years that followed. She let herself grieve honestly rather than performing recovery for an audience. She let her father's steady, patient love finally reach her, years later than it might have, but not too late to matter. And she built something in the wreckage of that failed marriage that was, by every meaningful measure, stronger and more honestly hers than anything she'd had before. Wishing every one of you the clarity to see the people around you honestly, the courage to act on what you see rather than talking yourself out of it, and the patience to rebuild carefully rather than rushing to fill the silence a broken chapter leaves behind. May you keep the people who love you quietly and let go, without regret, of the ones who only ever loved the version of you that was useful to them. Thank you for spending this time with Eleanor's story, and take good care of yourselves and of each other.